Page 166, Exercise B, a podcast on the brain and intelligence.
The human brain, one of nature's great mysteries. Though it's under nearly constant investigation by scientists around the world, we're still very far from a complete understanding of this miracle of biological design. Nevertheless, certain ideas about the brain seem to have captured the imagination of the public, namely the difference between the right brain and the left brain. A surprising number of quizzes on the internet offer to help you discover whether you're right-brained or left-brained. By answering a series of questions, these quizzes claim to be able to determine which side of your brain is the dominant one. A person whose left brain is dominant is thought to be rational with strong analytical and verbal skills. It is believed that left-brained people tend to use logic more and are objective about things. A right-brain dominant person, on the other hand, is seen as a creative and emotional individual with good synthesizing skills, someone who visualizes things well but tends to rely less on language. The right-brained are understood to be subjective and to prefer to use their intuition. If you're assessed as left-brained, you might be told you'd make a good scientist, engineer, or computer scientist. If you're judged to be right-brained, you might be told you'd make a good artist, designer, or counselor. But where does all this knowledge about the right and left brains come from? Is it really true? And should we be making life choices based on it? To answer those questions, we have to look at the research of Dr. Pierre-Paul Broca from 1861 in France. Broca examined the brains of people who had suffered from brain damage that affected their verbal ability. In each case, he found that there was damage to the left side of the brain. It seemed obvious that the speech problems were a direct result of the damage. Fast forward to scientist Roger Sperry's work in the 1960s in California. Sperry did simple experiments with medical patients whose right and left brains had been separated by delicate surgery to treat epilepsy, a serious medical condition. Due to the separation, the two halves of their brains were unable to communicate with each other. Thanks to the work of Broca and other experiments since that time, Sperry knew that the right brain controlled the left side of the body and vice versa. In one experiment carried out by Sperry, words appeared briefly on a screen in front of a patient, sometimes on the right side and sometimes on the left side of the screen. Because they were briefly shown, words on the left were processed only by the patient's right brain, and words on the right were processed only by the patient's left brain. Patients easily reported the words they saw on the right side. However, they didn't even see words that appeared on the left. Sperry believed that the difficulty seeing the words on the left was caused by the inability of the right brain to process language. From this experiment, Sperry concluded that the left brain was dominant in verbal processing. In another experiment that Sperry carried out, the split-brained patients were given objects that had shapes and patterns on them. Their task was to arrange these objects so that they matched shapes and patterns shown on a card, using just one hand. This was easy for them to do with the left hand, but the patients had an extremely difficult time doing it with the right. Sperry arrived at the conclusion that spatial abilities, including recognizing shapes, are in the right brain. Studies undertaken by other researchers in the following years linked damage to the right brain with the inability to recognize faces, problems with sense of space, and with emotional difficulties, particularly with understanding the emotional content of language. Unfortunately, the fascinating scientific discoveries of Broca, Sperry, and others led to some less than scientific conclusions about the brain in the fields of psychology and education. In particular, because the left brain was the center of language, and because language is perhaps the most important capability of the human brain, many concluded that the left brain is the dominant half. The original experiments by Broca and Sperry were gradually being forgotten while the left brain, right brain model expanded to represent two different thinking styles, or even two different personality types. Discussion of who was left-brained and who was right-brained became common in magazines, self-help books, discussion groups, and in classrooms. The influence of the right brain, left brain model on those in the education field was responsible for the idea that brain balancing activities could strengthen the less dominant side of the brain. Specifically, sitting up straight while doing math problems was recommended to strengthen the left brain, while lying down and drawing diagrams was supposed to strengthen the right. Clearly, the right brain left brain model had produced a great deal of enthusiasm, but it also seems that society had gone too far. It was up to modern brain science to bring us back to the facts. While the work of Broca and Sperry had clearly shown that the two sides of the brain have different characteristics, new technologies capable of mapping the brain showed electrical activity in both sides of the brain for every type of thinking. It is clear that the two halves of the brain work together all the time. Promising research is pointing the way to educational innovations that are based more closely on scientific facts. So the next time you take a quiz on the internet to find out whether you're right-brained or left-brained, remember that no matter which it says you are, your every thought is actually a product of both sides of your brain.